Say, Fred, there are quite a few new cars coming through now with air conditioning. I'm a little thin on servicing the refrigeration system. Do you think...
Well, I think you're asking for a quick course on system testing, right?
Yeah, but thinking about working with that refrigerant makes me nervous. I hear it's kind of tricky.
Not if you follow directions and work carefully. Just remember to handle refrigerant with respect, and it won't bite you. We can use this spray can to demonstrate the cooling process and help you over the hump on handling refrigerant. You see, they also use refrigerant in this can, only here the quantity is less and it's used as a propellant. Now, when refrigerant is under pressure, it's a liquid. But when you open the spray valve, pressure in the can drops and the liquid changes to gas. As it changes to gas, the refrigerant expands, absorbs heat, and gets rid of it with the spray, which is the reason why the can gets cold as you spray. In the same manner, refrigerant liquid changes to gas and absorbs heat in the evaporator, which cools the car. The main difference is that the car system automatically controls the flow and reuses the refrigerant instead of letting it escape. To cool a car interior, the refrigerant not only absorbs heat in the evaporator, but also carries it outside to the condenser. The process continues because the compressor raises the pressure and temperature of the warmed gas and pumps it around the system through the condenser, where it gets rid of heat and changes back to liquid.
Okay, I'll buy that, but how about testing? Where do you start?
First, you make a general check for things like broken or loose drive belts, clutch engagement, air doors not operating properly, or a water flow valve that doesn't shut off. Then you start in on the refrigeration part of the system.
And don't just guess at belt tension. Use the checking methods given in your service manuals to make sure. Slipping belts can really cut down the cooling output.
Hiya, Tech. Thanks for the reminder. Now, regardless of whether the system is charged or empty, you'll need this gauge set while checking system performance, finding leaks, or charging the system. So the next step is to check and connect the gauges.
I understand that some jobs don't need all three gauges.
Right. We use 3 gauges for checking evaporator pressure regulator valve systems. But with the clutch cycling system, you only use the left side and center gauges. The evaporator suction pressure gauge is at the left. The discharge pressure gauge is in the center, and the compressor inlet pressure gauge at the right.
When the gauge set is not connected, be sure and plug the hose adapter couplings to keep out dirt and moisture. And make a habit of keeping the valves closed so you won't lose a lot of refrigerant when you connect the hoses. Before you connect the gauge set, give the hoses a quick look to check their condition. Also check the coupling seal inserts because the couplings will leak if the seals are missing or damaged. The valve stem depressors and the hose couplings can release refrigerant as you connect the hoses at the compressor. Simply hold each seal insert tight against its service port while you tighten the coupling, and you can do the job without losing refrigerant. And always remember to be careful when you connect the gauge set or handle refrigerant. Escaping refrigerant freezes on contact, so play it safe by wearing goggles and protecting your hands. Now, what's the word on gauge checking, Fred?
Well, before I connect the hoses, I check the gauges by comparing their indications. All you do is connect each gauge hose in turn to the same service port at the compressor and note the gauge readings. Of course, the system must be shut down long enough for the pressure to stabilize. Each gauge should indicate the same pressure. If one gauge is off slightly, you can adjust it to agree with the other 2. But when you get a wide variation in the readings, the gauges probably need a calibration check.
Do you need a special tester to check gauge calibration?
Nope. You can check the gauges by comparing their indications against the pressure-temperature relationship chart in the service manual. All you need is a nearly full can of refrigerant and an accurate thermometer. Tape the thermometer to the can so its thermal sensing element is below the liquid level. Then connect the refrigerant can to the hose of the gauge to be tested and purge the air from the hose. Put the whole rig somewhere overnight where the temperature is stable. In the morning, compare the thermometer and gauge readings against the service manual chart to check the accuracy of the gauge.
Well, that sounds simple enough. Okay, Fred, how do you remember which hose connects where?
On either the clutch cycling or the EPR type system, the high-pressure center gauge always connects to the discharge service port near the front of the compressor. The clutch cycling system has only one other service port, so you can't go wrong. All you do is connect the low-range suction pressure gauge at the left side of the set to the inlet service port on the compressor cylinder head. For the EPR valve system, you need two low-pressure gauges, so the connections are different. Here you connect the suction pressure gauge at the left side to the suction pressure port at the rear of the compressor. The inlet pressure gauge at the right side goes to the cylinder head inlet port.
What's the story on the manifold valves? Do they control the gauges?
Nope. The gauges have direct passages through the manifold, so they can indicate pressure with the valves open or closed. The inlet pressure gauge at the right side connects directly to its hose. The solid extension from the manifold is only an attaching mount for the gauge. Actually, the valves only control the flow to and from the center manifold connection, which we use for charging or discharging the system. Some gauge sets also have an adjustable needle valve to slow down the discharge gauge pointer movement. Now, when you connect the hoses, first screw on the couplings finger tight at the compressor service ports. Then momentarily loosen the couplings under the connected gauges to purge air out of the hoses. If the gauge set has a needle valve, make sure it's partly open before you start checking system pressures. You begin testing with the engine shut off. Remember that system pressures gradually equalize and become static when the system is not operating. So test gauge pressures should read the same after the system stands long enough to stabilize. When the static pressure of the stabilized system is lower than normal, as shown on the temperature-pressure relationship chart in the service manual, the refrigerant level is probably low. Zero pressure indicates an empty system, usually due to a leak. Obviously, the first step in this case is to repair and recharge the system. Now, if static pressures are okay, you can make a preliminary pressure check while you warm up the engine for the regular service manual tests. In fact, when the discharge pressure comes up to at least 140 and evaporator suction pressure is above 20, you can begin with the overall performance test. The setup for the performance test is essentially the same as for pressure tests, but we also check the temperature of the cooled air. With the gauges connected, you arrange the hoses so the hood can be closed without pinching them. Room air temperature must not be lower than 75 degrees for the test. To test the system performance, set the engine at the specified speed and close the hood. Then open all the car windows and air outlet grills. The AC button must be in, the heat control off, and the blower on high. Run the system for at least 5 minutes so the parts will be at operating temperature before you check the test points. Prepare the psychrometer for use and put it at the air inlet opening on the cowl. Inside the car, you insert the stem of the dial thermometer all the way into the center air outlet at the right side of the grill opening. You take the temperature readings with the system stabilized and the discharge pressure indication between 190 and 210. If the pressure is lower, you can raise it by temporarily blocking the condenser airflow. However, if the pressure is higher, cool the condenser with external floor fans. Finally, you write down the dry and wet bulb temperatures shown on the psychrometer and do the same for the dial thermometer inside the car. Compare the figures against each other on the appropriate performance temperature chart in the service manual to determine if the system is operating properly.
If the overall performance test turns out okay, it saves the need for further testing. The results also prove that the system is operating at full capacity when there's any question about cooling output during hot, humid weather. Okay, Fred, now what's the story on the preliminary pressure check?
Well, we leave the engine running at the same test speed, but we remove the psychrometer and raise the hood. Also, we leave the windows open and the controls set as before. The AC button is in, the heat control is off, and the blower on high.
Just remember that overall operating pressures are usually higher than average when the weather is hot. You can easily find the pressures that are typical for average local conditions. Simply note the stabilized pressures after you prove the system is okay with an overall performance test. Right now, someone had better turn the record over so Fred can tell us how to interpret the gauge readings.
Good points, Tech. Now, if discharge pressure on the center gauge is higher than normal, between 240 and 300 pounds, it can mean an overheated condenser, restricted refrigerant flow, or a flooded evaporator. You see, the condenser can overheat and cause high discharge pressure if its airflow is restricted by dirty or bent condenser fins, or even a bug screen. Remember that hot weather can also cause overheating and reduced air conditioning output, especially with slow traffic or prolonged idling. Restricted refrigerant flow can be caused by a kinked line or by air trapped in the condenser. Either condition will build up the discharge pressure, but air also causes foam to appear in the sight glass on the receiver dryer. A flooded evaporator is usually caused by an open expansion valve, but too much refrigerant in the system can also cause flooding, even when the valve works properly. Both conditions cause high discharge pressure right along with high suction pressure.
Okay, how do you tell which condition is causing the flooding?
Cool the expansion valve thermal bulb in ice water. If the pressure's dropped, the valve's working okay. So too much refrigerant is the answer. Right, Fred?
Right, Tech. Now, at the other extreme, when you get discharge pressure that's lower than normal, it's usually a sign that the evaporator's not getting enough refrigerant. Here you may find a kinked line, low refrigerant level, or a starved evaporator. Low refrigerant level can result from a slow leak or improper system filling. When the level is low, all the gauge readings are low, but the side gauges do not drop below the zero line. I'll tell you about checking the level farther on. Now, when a starved evaporator causes low discharge pressure, the evaporator's suction pressure will also be low. But here, unlike the low refrigerant condition, the compressor inlet pressure drops to zero or below. A starved evaporator is usually caused by a closed expansion valve.
Check the expansion valve for opening by warming its thermal bulb in your hand. If the gauge pressure stayed down, the valve's not opening the way it should. All right, Fred, you've covered discharge pressure readings. Now, what's the story if evaporator suction pressure is higher or lower than normal?
Well, high suction pressure alone can be caused by too much refrigerant or an open expansion valve. But when both of the side gauges read high and remain high as you speed up the engine, the compressor capacity may be low. Now, in the opposite direction, low suction pressure can be caused by a starved evaporator or an EPR valve not operating properly. A starved evaporator puts out warm air, but an open EPR valve cannot slow down the cooling cycle, so the evaporator will be cold.
If suction pressure is lower than the normal 22-pound minimum and inlet pressure drops to the zero line or below, you'll probably find a closed expansion valve.
Thank you, Tech. Now, when the EPR valve stays open, both side gauges indicate the same lower than normal pressure, but neither one drops to zero or below as with a closed expansion valve. Keep in mind the fact that suction pressure must stay above 22 pounds.
Tom, just remember that these have all been preliminary pressure checks to alert you to possible trouble causes. And now it's time to review the service manual procedures for checking the expansion valve, the EPR valve, and the compressor. Ready, Fred?
Ready, Tech. And here's what you do. First, make sure the refrigerant level is correct, so pressure test indications will be dependable. To check the level, we run the engine at the specified speed and set the system controls as we did for the preliminary pressure check. In addition, we block the condenser airflow to raise refrigerant temperature and pressure. Blocking the condenser airflow should raise the discharge pressure somewhere between 225 and 250 for testing. If foam shows in the receiver dryer sight glass at this pressure, the refrigerant level is low and must be corrected before making the remaining pressure tests.
Fred, earlier you mentioned that the refrigerant level can be high as well as low. How do you get it right?
Well, in either case, some refrigerant is added to complete the level adjustment. So you leave the gauges connected and arrange a refrigerant source for system charging. Now, to correct a low refrigerant level, you add refrigerant until the foam disappears from the sight glass. Then you add exactly 1/2 pound more to get the correct level. Adjust the suction gauge valve to meter the inward flow of refrigerant so the gauge reading does not go above 50 pounds. When the level is high, you first release refrigerant slowly through the manifold test hose until foam starts to appear in the sight glass. Then you connect the refrigerant source, purge the manifold hose, and again add exactly 1/2 pound of refrigerant.
Refrigerant gas is heavier than air and will collect in a layer on the floor. So be sure you release it into the building exhaust system or outdoors. If refrigerant is exposed to an open flame, it becomes poisonous, so get rid of it. And while we're on the subject, when you release refrigerant for any reason, do it slowly, or you may lower the compressor oil level. If system pressure is released suddenly, the oil vaporizes and is carried out of the system by the escaping refrigerant. Be sure to check the compressor crankcase oil level before you charge an empty system after fixing a leak, because low oil level will quickly ruin a compressor. And use only approved refrigerant oil to correct the crankcase level. Engine oil must never be used in a refrigeration system.
Also, when a system comes in empty or is left open more than 15 minutes under high humidity conditions, you'll have to install a new receiver dryer. But there's no need to disturb the unit if you only replace some other part and immediately vacuum and recharge the system. Now, when the refrigerant level is okay, turn the engine off and check for leaks at all tube connections and other possible leak points. As you check for leaks, be sure to hold the sampling hose end or detector probe directly below the checkpoints, because refrigerant is heavier than air. And that brings us to the expansion valve, EPR valve, and compressor test. Room temperature must be at least 75 degrees for accurate checking. If the temperature is lower, pressure test readings can be misleading. For the test, you adjust engine speed as specified in the service manual. Set the controls for maximum air conditioning and high blower speed. Move the temperature control lever to full heat position and close the car windows and doors.
On some of our 69s with EPR valve systems, the vacuum-actuated water valve does not open when the max AC button is pushed in. Where there's no vacuum at the valve hose when the button is in, you connect to a direct vacuum source to open the valve for the EPR and expansion valve tests.
Thank you, Tech. Now, with the hood up, we stabilize the system by operating it for at least 10 minutes, and then check the gauges. Discharge pressure should read between 140 and 210. Discharge pressure lower than 140 indicates that the EPR valve does not open properly, that the expansion valve is closed, or that compressor capacity is low. To find the cause of low discharge pressure, you first check the expansion valve for proper opening by warming its thermal bulb in your hand. With the expansion valve open, the suction pressure reading should not be less than 40. Low pressure here points to a faulty expansion valve. Assuming that the suction pressure is okay, you then read compressor inlet pressure to check the EPR valve for proper opening. If the valve works properly, inlet pressure should read between 1 and 4 pounds lower than suction pressure. More than a 4-pound pressure drop calls for a new EPR valve. Next, we check the expansion valve for closing by immersing 5 inches of its thermal bulb in a container of ice and water at 32 degrees. When the valve closes, a suction pressure between 21 and 25 is okay. If the pressure stays above 25, the trouble may be either in the expansion valve or the compressor. To zero in on the expansion valve or the compressor, you raise engine speed to 1750 and recheck the gauge indication. If the suction pressure is now between 21 and 25, it indicates the trouble is in the compressor. Finally, you check the EPR valve for proper closing. Keep the thermal bulb in the ice water and slow the engine to the original test speed. With the suction gauge indication between 21 and 25, inlet pressure should be at 17 pounds or less if the EPR valve closes properly.
And all you need for the clutch cycling systems are the expansion valve and compressor tests.
Right. And when you make the tests, you'll have to connect the compressor clutch lead directly with a jumper. This keeps normal clutch cycling from interfering with the tests.
We don't have enough time left to go over the procedure for evacuating and charging an empty system, but that's all covered in detail in your service manual. Besides, Tom now has a good working knowledge of refrigeration system testing, so he's on his way. As usual, the reference book for this session includes all the information we covered in the film and more, so don't miss reading it through. We couldn't get everything into one meeting, so our next session will be a follow-up to cover the rest of the air conditioning system. So stay cool and be sure to reserve a seat for the next meeting.